Nora Callahan arrived at the Galactic Relations Institute with one duffel bag, a worn-out pair of sneakers, and a used copy of the Varath phonological database she had bought off a graduate student for $40. The graduate student had looked at her like she was buying a broken toaster. She paid anyway. The institute was all glass walls and polished floors, and the kind of silence that comes when people have spent a lot of money to make a building feel important. Nora stood in the entrance hall and looked at it the way she looked at most things, quietly, and for a little longer than felt normal. She was from a small town in Indiana. Her mother worked 2 jobs. The scholarship that got Nora here was the kind that schools give out once every few years, the kind that means someone read your file and felt something close to alarm. She had not told her mother how big the building was. Carol Dunning would have worried about the floors. The program had 42 students that year. Nora knew 3 things about them before she met any of them. They were mostly from big cities. Most of them had parents who worked in science or government. And most of them had been told their whole lives that they were exceptional. Nora had been told, her whole life, very little. She found her dorm room, put her bag on the bed, and opened the Varath phonological database to page 1. She had already read it twice on the bus. She started again. Professor Dale Pruitt ran the xenolinguistics program the way some men run a country, loudly, and with the firm belief that his way was the only way that had ever worked. He was tall, wore the same 3 blazers in rotation, and had a habit of looking at students like they were answers he already knew were wrong. His first seminar was on a Tuesday. He put a Varath sentence fragment on the board. No structural markers. He told the class they had 30 minutes. He did not say what it meant. He said that was the point. Kevin Holt went first. Kevin was the kind of person who raised his hand before he knew the answer, and figured out the answer on the way up. He was confident in the way that comes free with a certain kind of upbringing. He produced 4 paragraphs of analysis, spoke for 6 minutes, and was technically wrong about every single structural assumption he made, but said it all in a voice that made it sound like progress. 2 other students tried. They were wrong in smaller, quieter ways. Nora wrote 6 words on her notepad. She tore out the page. She walked to the front and placed it on Pruitt's desk and went back to her seat. Pruitt looked at it. His face did not move. He set it face down on the desk. He did not call on her for the rest of the seminar. After class, Nora went to the dining hall. She ate alone and thought about the 3rd tonal register in Varath compound verbs, which she had noticed had a pattern that nobody in the database had named yet. She thought it probably had something to do with intent versus outcome. She made a small note on a napkin. Lucy Farrow found her there. Lucy was pre-med, also on scholarship, also from somewhere flat and quiet in the Midwest. She had the kind of face that laughed at the wrong moments and meant it. She sat down across from Nora without asking, and stole a fry. "I saw what you wrote," Lucy said. Nora looked up. "Okay. I fished it out of the recycling bin after class. Pruitt threw it away." Lucy put her phone on the table. She had taken a photo. "I ran it through the Institute's translation check system. It flagged your answer as correct. There's apparently a known ambiguity in Varath's substructure that nobody has solved. And you kinda solved it, and he threw it in the bin." Nora looked at the photo of her own handwriting. 6 words. She had written them in about 4 minutes. "He wrote something on it," Lucy said. "In red pen." Nora looked at the photo more carefully. 1 word, in the margin, in red. Luck. She looked at it for a moment. Then she handed the phone back. "Can you send me that photo?" she said. "Yeah." "Nora, he just threw it away. You solved the 60-year-old problem in a 30-minute seminar exercise, and he threw it in the bin." "I know. Does that not make you want to punt kick something through a wall?" Nora thought about it honestly. "Yeah," she said, "a little." She ate the rest of her dinner. Lucy talked about her anatomy class. Nora listened and thought about the napkin note and whether the intent versus outcome pattern also appeared in the older dialects, or only the modern ones. That night, in the shared bathroom down the hall, when the floor was quiet and the lights were the dull yellow of late hours, Nora pressed her palm flat against the cold tile wall and stood there, just stood, not moving, not crying, just existing in the specific way a person does when they have been dismissed so many times that the dismissal no longer surprises them, but lands in the same place every time anyway. The wall was cold. She pressed harder. Fine, fine, fine. She went back to her room. She got the Verith database off the bed. She opened it to page 1. In the weeks that followed, she sat in Pruitt's seminars and answered when called on, and was correct in ways that Pruitt acknowledged with a nod, and moved past, like a car, rolling through a stop sign. Kevin Holt got praised when he got things partially right. Nora got nodded at when she got things completely right. She noticed. She said nothing. What she did instead was learn. She worked through the database faster than the course required. She started pulling texts from the Institute's archive. Old Verath records, pre-treaty documents, fragments from the Silence War period that had never been formally translated because nobody had been able to crack the phonological system they used. She cracked the first one on a Wednesday evening. She wrote up her notes. She filed them in a folder on her laptop and named the folder MISC. Lucy found out about the folder 3 weeks later and told her very seriously that naming a potential linguistic breakthrough MISC was the most Nora thing she had ever heard. Nora said, "Lord above, it's just notes." Lucy said, "Those are not just notes." Nora closed the laptop. They watched a bad science fiction film about aliens who communicated through dance. Nora pointed out 17 things wrong with the communication system depicted. Lucy laughed until she cried. Nora smiled, which for her was the equivalent of laughing until she cried. The semester moved on. Pruitt never called her to the front of the room. He never asked about the 6 words. The page she had written on lived folded in her jacket pocket, the word luck in red, facing inward, against her chest. She did not throw it away. She did not think about it too often. She kept reading, she kept learning. The universe, for its part, was already arranging things. The trip to Concord Station was not supposed to include Nora. Pruitt had been putting together a student delegation for the supervised exchange visit since the beginning of the semester. 5 students, a chance to see the orbital hub where Earth's relationship with the Galactic Concord actually lived and breathed. Kevin Holt was selected first. 3 others followed, all of them students who answered in seminars with authority and volume. Then the form came due, and Pruitt needed a 5th name, and Nora was standing near the department office when he walked past. He looked at her. He wrote her name down. He kept walking. She found out from the department board the next morning. Lucy said, "You're going to space." Nora said, "I'm going to an orbital station." Lucy said, "That is space, Nora." Nora went back to her room and looked at the Veroth pre-treaty fragments she had been working on, and thought about how the old dialect handled spatial relationships differently from the modern one. Then she packed a bag. The transport up was nothing like the films. It was loud and pressurized and smelled like recycled air and machine oil, and the seats were not comfortable in any way that suggested the designers had consulted a human body. Kevin Holt talked to the 2 students next to him about the contacts he intended to make at the station. Nora read. Concord Station was something else. She stepped out of the arrival bay and stopped moving. Not because it was beautiful, though it was. Not because it was large, though it was enormous. She stopped because it had a smell. Something warm, slightly sharp, with a low hum underneath it that she felt more in her back teeth than heard with her ears. She had no name for the smell. She stood very still and breathed it in, and her brain, without her asking it to, started sorting. There were Verith in the arrival bay. 3 of them, stationed near the diplomatic welcome team. They were tall, narrow-shouldered, with crests along their jawlines that shifted color the way a mood ring does, except the shifts meant something. Nora had read about the crests. She had spent 2 evenings with an old Concord biological database trying to map the color patterns to emotional states. It was not a perfect system, but she had a working theory. The official reception was in a long room with high ceilings and soft light. Human diplomats in good suits, Concord liaisons, a Vareth ambassador, and 2 aides. The students were introduced as a group and pointed to the side of the room and handed drinks that tasted faintly of something Nora could not name. Kevin Holt began working the room immediately. He was good at it. He had a warm handshake and a laugh that arrived on time. Nora stood near the wall and watched the Varath ambassador. His name was Vel Darun. She had seen his name in the pre-treaty documents. He had been part of the original contact team. He was, by Varath reckoning, very old, though his face showed it in ways she had no reference for. His crest was a deep, settled blue. He turned and looked at her. She looked back. She did not look away, which was probably wrong of her. The diplomatic briefing had said to let Varath delegates initiate all direct engagement. She had not looked away because she had not thought about it in time. The thought arrived about 3 seconds too late. Vel Darun walked toward her. The room did not notice at first. Then it did. He stopped in front of her. He was much taller up close. His crest shifted from settled blue to something lighter, with green at the edges. She had a theory about what that meant. He spoke, not in standard Galactic Creole, which was the language all Concord communication ran through. Not in the modern Vareth dialect. In the old one, the pre-treaty one, the dead one. 12 syllables, 2 tonal markers she recognized from the fragments she had been working on for weeks. A grammatical structure she had named, in her own personal notes, in the folder called MISC, the intent bracket. The room went very quiet. Nora's brain did the thing it did. It sorted. The syllables fell into the structure she knew. The meaning assembled itself without her having to reach for it, the way a familiar tune arrives fully formed when someone hums only the first bar. She answered. 8 syllables. She did not plan them. They were simply there. Vel Darun's crest fanned open. The blue went wide and bright, fanning out from his jaw to his temples in a full display that she had only ever read about in a footnote. The full crest display, the footnote said, is reserved for moments of profound recognition and is not commonly observed. The room stayed quiet. Nora became aware, slowly, that every human diplomat in the room was staring at her with expressions that ranged from confused to alarmed. The Vareth aides were watching their ambassador with expressions she could not fully read yet. Colonel Grant Bowman, whom she had noticed when she came in because he had the specific stillness of a man who was always watching, and never obviously doing so, was standing near the back wall, and was very, very still. Kevin Holt said, loud enough to carry across the quiet room, "Did she just make that up?" It was a fair question. She had almost made it up. The reception resumed. Plates moved. Drinks were refreshed. The diplomatic team smiled at things and said careful words. Nora stood near the wall again. Vel Darun found her 20 minutes later. His crest was back to blue. He leaned slightly toward her in the way she had read was a gesture of confidentiality. Not a bow, more like a tree in a light wind. He said in standard Creole, "We have been waiting for a speaker like you for 11 years. We assumed you did not exist." Nora looked at the middle distance. "Lord above," she said. Vel Darun tilted his head, his crest shifted. "Is that an oath?" "It's a coping mechanism." He did not say it like a request. She stayed where she was, and finished her drink, and thought about 11 years, and what it meant that someone had been waiting that long, and for something they believed did not exist. She thought about the folder on her laptop, called MISC. she thought about the word luck in red pen. She thought, fine, fine, fine. Then she thought, no, actually not fine, something else. She didn't have a name for the something else yet, but it sat differently in her chest than fine did. Less like a wall, and more like a door she had not noticed before, standing open, with warm, strange light on the other side. She folded her hands around the empty glass, and waited. The signal came from a ship that was supposed to be dead. A Varath warship, pre-treaty class, from the period of the Silence War, 2 centuries ago. It had appeared on deep-range scanners as a mass of cold metal, drifting at the far edge of a dying star cluster. The Concorde research vessel that found it sent back a report that used the word derelict 4 times in the first paragraph. Nobody expected it to be broadcasting. It was broadcasting. The signal had been running for 6 days by the time Nora heard about it. The Concorde's translation system, the most advanced linguistic processing network in the known galaxy, built over 30 years from the combined language databases of 14 species, had run the signal continuously for those 6 days and produced nothing useful. The output logs described the signal as structured noise, internally patterned but not decodable. Nobody framed it as urgent. The ship was dead. It had probably been broadcasting on a loop for 150 years into empty space. It was a curiosity. Bowman mentioned it to Nora on a Thursday. He handed her a printed transcript and said she could look at it if she wanted. As a courtesy. No pressure. 4 hours. He said it the way people say something is no pressure when they are quietly applying a great deal of pressure. She said, sure. He pointed her to a small room off the main communications corridor. A table, 2 chairs, a whiteboard, a window that looked out at the star cluster in question, which was far enough away that it looked like a faint smear of light, soft and fading. Pete Allard brought her a coffee without being asked. He was a junior communications officer, quiet, the way some people are naturally quiet. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they had learned to wait for the right moment. He sat in the second chair, pulled out a tablet, and opened a report he needed to file. He did not say anything about the signal. Nora read the transcript. It was 43 pages, dense. The syllable strings were marked in the Concorde's notation system, which she found slightly annoying because the notation system had been designed for the modern Varath dialect, and the old one handled breath pauses differently. She made a small note in the margin, then another. By page 9 she was making sounds under her breath. Not words, not quite speech. Something between humming and thinking out loud, the way some people tap their fingers when they work, except this was tonal and rhythmic, and followed the signal's pattern in a way she was not consciously directing. Pete looked up once, looked back down at his tablet, did not look up again. On page 22, she stopped, went back to page 4, read a section again, read it a 3rd time. The sounds she was making changed register, lower, slower. She put the transcript down and looked at the whiteboard, got up, found a marker, started writing. Not words, structural diagrams, chains of phonological markers linked by lines she drew in 3 colors, pulling the marker out of the tray and putting it back in a rotation that had its own rhythm. Pete filed his report, started another one, stayed. 4 hours became 9. Nobody came to collect her. She assumed someone had noticed and decided not to interrupt. She was right. Bowman had quietly asked the corridor staff to leave the room alone. At the 9-hour mark, she stood back from the whiteboard and looked at what she had drawn. It covered 3 panels. It had a shape. Not the shape of a language exactly. The shape of a message inside a language. The way a picture can hide inside a pattern of colored dots if you know how to look. She turned around. Pete was still there. He had long since stopped filing reports and was just sitting, hands around a cold coffee cup, watching the whiteboard the way someone watches a fire. Not because they understand exactly what it is doing, but because it is clearly doing something real. "It's a map," Nora said. Her voice came out rougher than expected. She had been quiet for 9 hours. Pete said, "A map to what?" She looked at the whiteboard, at the chains and links, and the shape underneath all of it. "I have no idea," she said, "but it's definitely a map." She called Bowman. He arrived in 4 minutes, which told her he had been close by, which told her he had been waiting. He looked at the whiteboard for a long time. He did not say anything. He called someone on his comm. Then he called someone else. Within 2 hours, the room had a new whiteboard, 3 additional monitors, and access to the full stellar cartography database of the Concorde. Vel Darun arrived with one of his aides, and stood in the doorway and looked at what Nora had drawn, and his crest went the pale, almost white color she had not yet seen from him before. She made a mental note. The coordinate system in the map was the problem. It did not match any known stellar chart, not Earth's, not the Verath's, not any of the 14 species in the Concorde's shared database. The reference points the signal used were real. They were stars, real stars in a dying cluster, but the configuration they formed did not exist, not currently. One of the Concorde's cartographers ran the decay models on the cluster's dying stars. He went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with professionalism. The configuration in the map, the exact arrangement of stellar bodies that the signal's coordinate system was built around, would exist in approximately 400 years, when a specific sequence of stellar collapses completed. At the current rate of decay, that sequence would begin in approximately 9 years. The room, when Bowman briefed the senior staff, went the kind of quiet where everyone is doing math in their heads and nobody likes where the numbers are going. Nora stood at the whiteboard and thought about the signal, about what it meant that a dead ship had been broadcasting for 150 years toward a receiver that did not exist yet, about what kind of mind builds a message for someone who has not been born, about what they were trying to warn that someone about. She thought about this very carefully and thoroughly, and then she thought, Lord above. Vel Darun asked to meet with her privately that evening. He asked in the old dialect. She answered in the old dialect. He nodded once, slowly, and the white in his crest deepened. Bowman watched her leave for the meeting. He had offered to send someone with her. She had said no. He had let her go alone, which cost him something, and he knew it, and he went back to his desk and looked at the cartography models for a long time. Nora walked down the corridor toward Vel Darun's quarters. The station hummed around her. The star cluster was visible through the corridor windows, faint and fading, a smear of dying light. Something old and deliberate and patient had built a message for a receiver it would never meet, in a language it trusted would survive, pointed at a moment in time it calculated but could not see. Nora pressed her hand flat against the corridor wall as she walked. It was warm, the way the station always was, full of heat and machinery and the deep low hum. The emergency session of the Galactic Concorde convened 14 species in the same room, which had only happened twice before in recorded history. Both previous times had been wars. This was not a war yet, but the math said it was heading somewhere worse. The signal from the dead Verath warship had carried a warning about a weapon, something left behind from the Silence War, buried inside the dying star cluster, set to trigger when the stellar collapse sequence reached a specific point. Not a natural disaster, not a rock falling, a deliberate thing designed and armed and left by a civilization that had been destroyed 200 years ago, and had apparently decided that if they were going, they were taking the rest of the galaxy with them on a very long delay. The Concorde had 9 years, maybe less, depending on the decay rate calculations, which 3 different scientific teams were currently arguing about in 3 different corridors. The problem was not the weapon itself. The problem was communication. to coordinate a response across 14 species, 14 different biological systems, 14 different ways of processing information, 14 sets of fears and histories and political pressures. Someone had to build a framework. A shared language that did not yet exist. A system that could carry technical data, emotional nuance, political context, and the specific weight of the phrase, "We are all going to die if we do not do this right," in a way that every species present could receive without distortion. The Varath had 3 possible human translators on file. 2 were senior linguists with 20-year careers, who had spent those careers working in standard Galactic Creole and the modern Varath dialect. The third was a 20-year-old scholarship student from Indiana, who had a folder on her laptop called MISC. Vel Darun put her name forward, formally, in the old dialect, which required 2 aides to translate for the chamber, which took 40 minutes, and the irony of this was not lost on anyone. Nora was given a room, a whiteboard, Pete Allard, and access to every linguistic database the Concord held. She had 11 days before the preliminary response vote required a working communication draft. She started on page 1. The framework she was building had to do something that had never been done before. It had to allow real-time interpretation across 4 phonological families, groups of languages that shared no common root, no shared logic, no shared biological basis for how sound was produced or received. 2 of the 14 species communicated primarily through gesture rather than sound. 1 communicated through a system of resonant vibration that human ears registered as a single flat tone, but carried 40 distinct meaning layers. She mapped it all. She built columns and cross-references, and subsystems, and testing loops. She worked in silence, and in those low tonal sounds that Pete had learned not to interrupt. She slept for short windows and woke up mid-thought. Pete brought her food, she ate it. He filed things on his tablet. He asked no questions about the work. She did not explain it. It was the most productive working relationship she had ever had. Lucy called on day 4. Nora answered on the 3rd ring. "You sound weird," Lucy said. "I'm fine." "You sound like you're building a new language." "I'm building 3. A pause. Then Lucy said, "Oh good, that's healthy." She stayed on the call. She talked about her anatomy practical, and about a movie she had seen, and about the dining hall changing the soup. Nora sat on the floor of the room, and listened, and did not talk about the weapon, or the cluster, or the 14 species, or the 9 years. They stayed on the call for 40 minutes. After she hung up, Nora looked at the whiteboard for a long time. Then she picked up the marker and kept going. On day 8, Kevin Holt arrived. He was part of an official observer delegation the Institute had been allowed to send. A gesture of political goodwill more than anything else. He walked into the room and stopped. He looked at the 3 whiteboards covered in Nora's columns, diagrams, and color-coded cross-references. He stood there for a long time without saying anything. Pete watched him from the corner. Kevin said finally, "I couldn't have done this." Nora was at the board with a marker. She did not look up. "I know," she said. It was the first time she had said it out loud. Not with anger. Not with anything sharp at all. Just the plain, flat truth of it. The way you might say it is cold outside. Or the bus is late. A fact. Nothing more. Kevin stood there a moment longer. Then he sat down in the spare chair and was quiet, and she let him stay, which was its own kind of thing. The preliminary session came on day 11. The chamber was very large and full of the specific tension that comes when beings with very different biologies all have the same fear. Nora sat at the interpreter station with a headset built for human ears and a secondary unit built for a Varath hearing range that extended into frequencies humans could not detect without equipment. She had requested both. The station technician had looked at her. She had looked back. He had built her both. The session ran for 6 hours. Nora worked the whole time. The translation moved in real time across phonological families and gestural systems, and the resonance language, the 40-layer one, which she had built a notation compression for that reduced the interpretation delay from 11 seconds to 2. At the 4-hour mark, a faction that had been resistant since the session began raised a formal objection. Not to the plan, to Nora. A human child, their representative said through 2 layers of translation. An unverified student. Unproven. The response effort for a 9-year countdown to a galaxy-level threat should not rest on something so uncertain. The room considered this. Vel de Rune stood. He spoke in the old dialect. Not standard Creole. Not the modern Verath, the old one. He spoke directly to Nora. The interpreters at their stations all went still. Their systems flagged the dialect. None of them had a working translation. Nora answered. She spoke back in the old dialect, to the full chamber. Her voice was steady. Her accent was not Verath, was not anything that existed in any official record, was something that had come into being 6 weeks ago in a small dorm room in a building full of people who had shrugged at her work and moved on. She and Vel de Rune spoke to each other for approximately 90 seconds. The room stayed very still. The 14 species in that room could not follow the content. But sound has a shape before it has a meaning. The shape of what passed between them in those 90 seconds was not a demonstration. It was not a test. It was simply 2 people speaking to each other with trust, and even beings with different biologies and different languages and different ways of knowing the world understood the shape of trust when they heard it. The chamber voted. 14 species, no dissent. Bowman in the back row wrote 1 line in his notes. He did not let anyone see it for a long time. She sat on the floor. The whiteboard was behind her, covered in the work of 11 days. The station hummed. Outside the small porthole window, the star cluster burned its slow and dying light. She thought about Pruitt's red pen, about the word luck, about 11 years and a ship broadcasting into the dark for someone it trusted would be there to hear. She pressed her back against the wall and stayed very still. Not fine. Not fine at all, actually. Something much bigger and stranger than fine. And she was not going to say what it was, and she was not going to explain it to anyone. After a little while, she let herself cry briefly and quietly, and then she stopped, and she looked at the ceiling. Then she stood up and went to the whiteboard and started working on Phase 2. The response effort took 8 months. Not 8 months of drama. Not 8 months of narrow escapes and last-second heroics. 8 months of work. The kind of work that does not make good viewing, but keeps everything alive. Sustained, careful, relentless coordination across 14 species and 4 phonological families and 2 gestural systems and 1 resonance language that still gave Nora a mild headache when she ran it for more than 3 hours straight. The framework held. The communication held. The 14 species held together in a way they had not managed in 2 centuries, because they had a shared language for the first time. Not a perfect one, not a complete one, but one that let them say the important things to each other, without losing too much in the gap between their very different minds. The weapon was neutralized. The collapse sequence was interrupted. The cluster's dying stars kept dying, because stars do not stop dying for anyone. But the thing buried inside them went dark and stayed dark. The Concord issued a formal statement. It was thorough and measured, and 7 pages long, and mentioned Nora Callahan once, in a dependent clause on page 4, as a key member of the communications team. She had asked for that. The Concord's communications director had argued for a full paragraph. Nora said the dependent clause was fine. She said it twice, which for her was emphasis. She went home to Indiana. Carol Dunning made her daughter a meal she had not had since she was 12. Biscuits, and the specific gravy that was not quite right anywhere else, and sweet corn, and the kind of quiet that comes with a house that has only two people in it, who understand each other without needing much conversation. They did not talk about the weapon or the stars, or the old dialect, or Veldarun, or the 14-species chamber vote. They watched television, a cooking show, a documentary about birds, something that made Carol laugh. Nora sat on the couch in her socks and ate everything on her plate, and for 2 weeks she did not think about phonological families or decay models or the weight of things that rest on one person's particular and strange and quietly enormous brain. It was the best 2 weeks of her life. She told no one this because she did not think anyone would understand why. The formal recognition ceremony happened in her absence. Bowman accepted her commendation. He read her statement aloud to the chamber. It was 43 words long, the shortest statement ever entered into official Concord record. He did not mention that she had written it on a napkin in 6 minutes while Pete drove her to the transport dock. He read it in a voice that was steady and did not show anything, because he was a man who had spent 20 years learning to read rooms, and part of that learning was knowing when a room deserved to feel the weight of something without being told how heavy it was. The chamber was quiet afterward for about 4 seconds. 4 seconds in a room that size is a long time. Back at the Institute, Pruitt announced his retirement at the end of the semester. The department newsletter described it as a planned transition. Nobody in the department said anything different out loud. A few of them had private conversations over coffee that ended with long pauses and careful changes of subject. Kevin Holt changed his dissertation topic. His previous topic had been a comparative analysis of modern Varath political rhetoric, which was a safe topic, a well-mapped topic, a topic that would produce a clean and competent dissertation, and a respectable career. His new topic was the Callahan Communication Framework, which was what 3 universities, 2 Varath academies, and 1 research station that technically did not have a curriculum had already started calling it. He did not ask Nora before he changed his topic. He did not tell her after. She found out when one of the Varath Academy contacts sent her a copy of his opening chapter with a note asking if she would consider reviewing it. She reviewed it. She sent back 2 pages of notes. They were thorough and direct, and had no softening around the edges, the way her work never did. Kevin read them twice, and then made every change she suggested, without arguing. The new division opened on a Tuesday, which felt right. Nora arrived and Pete Allard was already there. He had not announced he was taking the position. He had simply shown up. She saw him and said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "I know." He held the door for a visiting delegate who had her hands full of files. It was a small and ordinary morning, and she thought it was a pretty good way to start. The Varath Commission was completed 2 months after the weapon went dark. Not a monument. The Varath did not build monuments to people. What they built instead was a record, a linguistic record in the old dialect, stored in their most permanent archive, the kind of archive their culture had been keeping for 1,000 years. A story, the oldest and most serious form of honor they had. Lucy somehow obtained a partial translation. She called on a Sunday. Nora was eating cereal. "They basically called you a force of nature," Lucy said. "In the good way. The old dialect doesn't have a direct term for it, so they built one. It translates roughly as, okay, this is the translation, hold on. Something like a pattern that arrives before it is understood." Nora ate her cereal. "They built a new word for you. Lord above. Is that all you have to say? What do you want me to say?" "I want you to say that is incredible, and maybe make a sound like a normal person would make." Nora looked out her window. The morning was gray and quiet, and she could hear the station's environmental hum, which she had stopped noticing months ago, and now only noticed when she thought about it. "It's a nice thing," she said. "It's a really nice thing." "That's it? That's the sound?" "That's the sound, Lucy." Lucy laughed. Nora smiled. They talked for a while about nothing important, the way they had always been best at. And then Lucy had to go to a thing, and Nora had to go to a thing, and they said goodbye in the way old friends do, already knowing they would talk again soon. The plaque was Bowman's idea. It was not officially authorized. It was not in any procurement record. He had it made somewhere off station, and brought it in himself, and put it on the door of the main translation room one evening. And by morning, everyone had seen it, and no one removed it. On one side, in English, she thought it was luck too. On the other side, in the old Varath dialect, the same words. Nora read it every morning when she came in. She did not comment on it to Bowman. He did not comment on it to her. They had the kind of working relationship where the important things got said once, sideways, and then did not need saying again. The red-penned page was no longer folded. It lived flat now, pinned to the wall above her desk. The word luck in red pen faced outward, visible to anyone who came in, which many people did. Some of them asked about it. She said it was a note from a seminar. They looked at the one red word and then at the room full of whiteboards, and the view of the star cluster through the window, and the 14 species flags on the wall, and they usually went quiet for a moment before moving on. The cluster was still dying, out there past the window. Stars don't stop for anything. They burn and collapse and go dark in their own time and on their own terms, and do not ask to be understood. Nora looked at it sometimes when she was between things. Just looked. The faint smear of it, still fading, still warm. Something had sent that signal across 200 years of silence, because it trusted someone would be there to hear it. She had been there. That was not luck. That was never luck.